Yes. Cheers. So I learn your roots and understand you better.
Well, the first thing, John, we're going to have to clear up is you have to call me Marshall.
Okay.
Because, we're all in the same business. You were one of our trainees, one of our best, and I just can't accept the fact that you call me Dr. Parks now when you're no longer in our training program. You're one of my colleagues, one of my respected colleagues. Let me tell you about John first, because John's been very interested in roots. Seems that anybody who has a root, he's going to dig up that root. And so now he has me here in Chicago on November 16th, 1993 at the Northwestern Medical School with this exquisitely planned arrangement here to get me on tape, to learn my roots. I take it. Isn't that right, John?
Yes.
John did this same thing, only not so fancy, some years ago. You know, I was on the Asia Pacific program through the courtesy of John, and John arranged everything for that trip to Seoul, Korea. In fact, I think he made 2 trips prior to my arrival there just to make sure everything was fine. And then I had a chance to see John's roots, and I thoroughly enjoyed it and learned so much. But this really tells us about what kind of a person he is. Now, John has investigated my roots. He's been to my birthplace. The house was torn down, but he dug up some rocks and brought some rocks from the house that was destroyed in northern Michigan. And here I have those rocks under glass now in my house as the only artifact containing my roots. He then chartered an airplane. He made an aerial photograph of my area which I was born in, up in the northern peninsula of Michigan, in the arm that separates Travers Bay, the Little Travers, and some other Travers name. And I was born out on the tip then of this peninsula at a place called Old Mission. Now, Old Mission is nothing but a filling station, and it has a little store inside the filling station, and also serves as a mailbox. I think there are 2 houses in town, and that's my birth site. And John, I'll carry on from there, but I do want the people to understand what kind of a person you are and how persistent you are to learn about anyone's roots, mine included.
Thank you. I truly believe a man is there, not overnight. There's a path he takes. And I would like to know more about your heritage, grandparents, parents, your birth, and the path it took to today.
Well, that takes it back into almost medieval history, because at my age, my grandparents have been dead for a number of years. I do have some very fond memories of them. I guess my heritage I can trace back to my Scottish background primarily, from at least my mother's side, and my father's Scotch, English, Dutch, so forth. He's kind of a mixed breed. My mother was more thorough in terms of being totally Scotch. And they were people that had migrated out of Europe, as was custom and they become commonplace during the early part of the 19th century. And my mother's family finally somehow got to central Illinois through Canada. In fact, they settled in Jacksonville, Illinois, not too far from you, John. You're in Decatur, Illinois. And my grandfather left the farm, and his education was eight grades. And after 8 grades, then he taught a country school, all grades. That's his only education. This would be right after the Civil War. And he had an ambition to do more than that. And I guess I can say I must have gotten some of his genes, because he apparently was a very ambitious person, and he wanted to excel. And he didn't have any money, so his idea of accumulating money was in order to advance his objective, was to drive cattle. So he used to go into Texas and he'd drive cattle. This is before the railroad, and bring them up to Omaha and to Sioux City, Iowa, and to St. Louis. And so I used to love to hear those tales that he would tell us about driving cattle. And he earned enough money then to enter the law school at University of Michigan. Now, what schooling he had between is not clear to me, but I'm sure it wasn't very much beyond that 8th grade. But anyway, he got into law school, and I have a picture of his graduation from law school And I believe it's about 1884 or something like that. And there are 6 people who were graduating from law school in this particular picture. And I also love one of my stories, the stories my grandfather used to say. But 2 of us didn't live very long because they hung 2 of them for stealing horses. So this is the beginning. Now, he went to practice in Jacksonville, Illinois, which is just outside his farm that he was raised in. And there he entered the practice of, actually it was Douglas, Lincoln Douglas debates occurred
Yes.
there and outside the courthouse, which I was just there a few weeks ago. Saw the sign of where the Lincoln Douglas debate occurred on the steps of the courthouse. Well, he was in the practice with Douglas, and he eventually became the Attorney General in Illinois and was a well-known lawyer, but he died at a rather young age. But in the meantime, he accumulated land. His idea of wealth was something you had to palpate. It wasn't stocks or bonds at that time. It was something you could actually see and feel, and that was dirt. So he accumulated a lot of dirt. He got dirt out in Iowa, and he got dirt in northern Michigan. And the fact he got dirt in northern Michigan is the reason I was born in northern Michigan. I was born on some of my grandfather's property up there. There was a summer property. It's a cherry orchard up in old Michigan. And so that's where that came about. Now, my mother was one of 5 children, and she was the oldest. And she was going to be a school teacher. And all it took to teach school in her time in the late part of the 19th century was that she have a high school graduation. And that was it. So she did teach school for a year or 2. But she met up at her family's place in northern Michigan. The whole family would go up there for the summer to take the train up, and everybody would have their trunk of clothes and so forth, and then they'd live up there for the entire summer. But she met one summer a person known as Reuben, and then it was just dear Reuben until they were married, and that Reuben is my father. And he was a local boy, and he was orphaned because his father worked as a fireman. A fireman at that time, there was a team of horses and a big fire thing that they pulled around in this small town of Elk Rapids, Michigan. In the one winter night, he slid off the fire engine that the horses were pulling, and he was run over by the wheel, and he was killed. And this was when my father was 2 years of age. And his mother then never worked. She became a practical nurse. And it's important about that fact she became a practical nurse, because as it turns out, she actually delivered my twin brother and myself when we were born, and we were born in this home, this summer home on this cherry orchard on July 6, 1918, unexpectedly, because my mother didn't even know she had twins. This was her second pregnancy. I have a sister who's a year and a half older than me. And at that time, for the July 4th holidays, which was the beginning of the season, then my father, who at that time was working in the bank in Traverse City, Michigan, but my older sister and my mother and also my father had come out to the summer place out in Old Mission, Michigan, which is about 15 miles north of Traverse City, Michigan, and they were then staying with the family for a few days. I mean, my mother's family and her sister and brother, and etc. And apparently, my mother went into precipitous labor, and my grandmother on my father's side just happened to be there, and that's a kind of across the bay from Elk Rapids. And thank goodness she was, because she was the midwife, and actually as a result then, I was born there. I always felt a little bit disappointed the fact that I was born on the back porch. I think I really would like to say I was born on the front porch, but I got to start on the back porch in Michigan. I was the first of the 2 born twins, and we were premature, and my grandmother got us through that period, and here I am.
It's a beautiful area up there. I recall walking around your birthplace. I'll just hold it, and then when you're ready, just do that. No, you don't have to go very far. I'll watch.
Anytime, sir.
All right. I think that covers pretty well my mother's background. It didn't say much about my father. He was a high school graduate from this small town in northern Michigan. Elk Rapids is the name of the place. And I'm sure it never occurred to him to go to college. It was certainly totally out of his risk. As orphan boy and his mother having no money. He had to work to support a sister who was actually born after his father was killed. And so therefore he got a job at the bank in Traverse City. But apparently that wasn't good enough for his father-in-law, my grandfather, that was the lawyer from Jackson, Illinois. And he had the idea that maybe his first son-in-law should become involved in managing some of his property. So he had some farms out in western Iowa that he felt uneasy about, didn't think they were being managed properly. So he then sent my father and his young family, including myself, out to western Iowa. And so we lived on two different farms out there, first by near Ida Grove, Iowa, and then I have no memory of that because I was less than 3, and then over to Charter Oak, Iowa. And we lived there through my first memory period, and where I started first grade in Charter Oak, Iowa. And I can tell you that my father was a better banker, I hope, than he was a farmer, because apparently they lost those 2 farms, and as a result of the loss of the farms, the bank taking them over, well then that ended my rural existence in Iowa. And at that time then we moved to Chicago, and my father then began to try to work for the Holland Furnace Company. Holland furnaces were made in Holland, Michigan, and I remember always one of those attractive ads they had. They had red hearts in their ads, and it said, "Holland furnaces make warm friends." So that's one of the things I was always proud about. My father worked for the Holland Furnace Company, so he would sell furnaces, but he knew something about heating, and he had a little course in engineering. But that was his education. Never made any money out of it. But sooner or later, we got into family troubles with the Depression.
I see. I was just remembering the time I was up at Old Mission, Michigan. It's a beautiful area. With cherries, somewhat of rolling terrain. And I tried to imagine what it was like about 70 years back and walked your birthplace. And I still remember that day. Could you tell us how depression has affected you?
Well, I think so, but I think there's a little story I'd like to tell you first about Chicago, and this would be in the 1925 era, and that's really before the Depression. The Depression hit, beginning in 1929, and then 30, 32 was terrible. But in the 1925 era, when we first moved to Chicago, my twin brother and I took ill with diphtheria. Now at that time, we didn't have diphtheria inoculations. And the only treatment for diphtheria was antitoxin, which was created by the diphtheria bacteria in the horse, and then they take the serum which had the antibody, and then you inject that into the patient. So I can remember our house being quarantined. And by the way, we lived on in Groveland Park. It's a little enclave at 33rd and Cottage Grove here in Chicago. And that place still stands. In fact, just a few months ago, I drove my wife by to see the apartment that we lived in this place, and it's still there just as it was. It was right on the Illinois Central tracks, and so we used to go down and look at the trains go by. And then the next thing over that view would be to look at the lake, the ships on the lake, and I have that rich in my memories, watching those wonderful trains just constantly going by, and then also watching the ships. Well, in that particular site is where this diphtheria occurred in our life, and we were quarantined, and my brother and I were in the same bed, and he died of this diphtheria. And I can recall very well this doctor who came by every morning to give us a shot of antitoxin, and my parents were, of course, grieving because here my brother who just died was lying next to me in bed, and I heard him say to my parents, "Well, I'm sure that," he pointed to me, "I will be dead in the next few hours with the same disorder." And that, I can recall, troubled me very much. But I think that had a certain bearing on my life in terms of what I wanted to do with my life. And so I would start there with somewhat of a somewhat of an explanation as to what did really affect me in my life. And then next, I think, is the question you asked about the depression. And the depression really did affect us because my father didn't have a stable income. We moved down to Jacksonville, Illinois. He became a branch manager for the Holland Furnace Company down there. But with the depression, he was in real bad shape. He moved to Mattoon, Illinois, trying to come out of the hardship we had in Jacksonville, Illinois. Lived there for 2 years. And I can tell you that the depression, which was really bad then in the early 30s and I was entering into high school, certainly did affect my life and my values. And I think it did to anybody who lived through that particular year, and I'll be happy to expand more on it if you want to specifically ask me a question about that.
Please do. Some difficult situations bring some good things. And I think some positive things that this difficult depression period may have brought to you. I'd like to know about that.
Well, I'll be happy to try to put this together, and the most factual, not informed that would embellish my life, for a cause, other than what I'd like it to be, just as plain as possible. The problem in our family was money for rent, and money for food. That's what it came down to. And as a result, we lived at that time in our life at a place called 118 Hardin Avenue, Jacksonville, Illinois. Now, that was pretty near into town. But for food, then I got a job working in a kind of a restaurant confectionery. And so an hour's work would then give me a meal. And so that was important. And this was during high school. So in high school, then I started with supporting myself by not eating in the family because there just wasn't that food available. My father was without a job. There's no unemployment compensation at that time. And I know he finally got a job working as a clerk in a paint store, and everybody was so happy because now he was going to make $14 a week working in this paint store. And another thing he did was he got a job trying to sell Fords. Fords at that time cost $599 for a new car. And the great rejoicement, I can recall, in our family is that one day he sold a Ford, much to his surprise, probably as well as everybody else. And there was a bit of money then from the commission he got out of that $599 Ford, which was so important at that time. So that just gives you an idea of how hard things were. Now, in our house at 118 Hardin Avenue, there wasn't enough money to pay this $15 a month rent. And so my mother then would rent out rooms. And they only had one bathroom in there, but these rooms all had to use that one bathroom, myself included. Therefore, there was not a room for me, so the room I had was the kitchen. So I had a fold-away cot. I had to sleep in the kitchen. And then just work at odd jobs during high school, but no school in Jacksonville, Illinois that I could attend. Actually, there were two schools. One was a woman's school, and I didn't want to attend a woman's school. In fact, I wasn't the right sex. So the Illinois College was a co-educational school. And so I just enrolled in Illinois College. But you see, I didn't have any money. And I had tried to save as much as I could, but I didn't have the full amount to pay for the first semester. Now, the first semester cost $90. And at the time, I only had, I think, $80. Well, they didn't look kindly upon that. And then when I said, they asked, what am I going to enroll in? And I said, pre-medicine. And they said, you mean you are going to go on a medical school and you don't even have enough tuition to pay for the first year at Illinois College? And I said, that's right. But they let me pay it off $1 a week, which I did. And then I continued for the rest of the year working for many hours a week, more than 50 hours a week, in order to get them money to pay for the second semester. So that's what I did, was just commonplace. It wasn't just Marshall Parks doing this. Everybody, if they wanted to excel, faced with the same situation, and yet they put it together and they got something out of it. And I think you're absolutely right, and at least what I think you intimated, and that is, yeah, there's a bit of travail in your life. It actually it helps in terms of giving you a drive that is never lost throughout your life.
Thank you. As I studied your path, I had the opportunity to look at the yearbook of Illinois College, and I saw your sister 1 year, I believe, ahead of you. And could you tell us about your brothers and sisters? You mentioned about one brother.
Well, the only brother I had was
I
my
see.
twin brother, and so
I
he
see.
died when we were 7 years of age. Now we're up to where we're in Illinois, we're in college. And my sister was a year ahead of me in school and also in college. Now she had the same drive. She worked as a waitress, and she accumulated enough money working as a waitress to put herself through college.
1 year, I believe, ahead of you.
That's right.
And could you tell us about your brothers and sisters? You mentioned about one brother.
Yes. Well, the only brother I had was my twin brother, and so he died when we were 7 years of age. Now we're up to where we're in Illinois, we're in college. And my sister was a year ahead of me in school and also in college. Now she had the same drive. She worked as a waitress, and she accumulated enough money working as a waitress to put herself through college. So I can say that we were very comparable in our ambitions, in our purposes of life in that respect. She continues to live today. She lives in Kalamazoo, Michigan. But then she was a laboratory technician. That's what she trained herself for after she finished college.
Yeah.
She also got a job working on the Great Lakes, on the steamers that took cruises. And this was the Chicago, Duluth, and Georgian Bay Transit Company, which had 3 ships, the North American and the South American, and then also the Alabama. And she would work on the South American as a waitress. Now that was very fortunate, because through that connection, I managed to get a job on the North American. And that's essential that that happened, because then I could earn more money than I could if I remained in Jacksonville, Illinois. And that was the key to my earnings that allowed me to get enough to go to medical school at St. Louis University. I'll tell you about that story if you want to hear about that.
Oh, yes.
You want to hear about the medical school then?
Yes. You have other siblings?
I have 2 other siblings. I was I was 5 years old when my next sibling was born out in Charter Oak, Iowa. And I remember being taken to the neighbor's farm, and I stood there in that window. I have this memory almost all afternoon, because I was looking for a stork. I could see the house, but I was told that the baby would be delivered by a stork. This is what they told children at that age. But I was very disappointed. I never saw a stork, and yet I got the news that my next sister was born. But I learned later, they don't come by storks. That's my sister Marion. And she completed college. By that time, the family was a little bit more capable of rendering some financial help. And with her work and also a little help, then she went to Southern Illinois College down in Carbondale and finished. And she became a teacher and taught throughout her life in the Illinois school system until now she's retired. Then my youngest sister, named Patricia, was born 9 years later. Now she's the only one of our 4 children, as far as I know, that was born in a hospital. I can remember my mother going to the hospital to have her, but at 9 years old, I knew that babies didn't come by the stork. So she finished high school and never went to college. And she married her college sweetheart, her high school sweetheart, some years later, and he became one of the more successful people in this country.
and his name was Roy Short, and he worked for Schlumberger, Schlumberger, as most people say Schlumberger. And if you look at the card on your that we use for the American Academy here, and there's a little card in there. It says it's the credit card you can buy anything at the Academy, at the technological exhibits or wherever. And you turn that card over, you can see that's a Schlumberger product. Well, Schlumberger was really started as the oil drilling equipment, a firm in France, and he then, after finishing his duty in the Navy during World War II, then came back, and my sister Patricia and he went to school at the Rolla School of Mines, and he excelled there, and he was hired then as a very young green engineer by Schlumberger, and so now, some 30 years later, he was the chairman of the board, he was the president and CEO of this international company, and he's very, very well off as a result of that. But he had, again, the same drive that we talk about to excel. So that was my sister's life. So they live in Houston, Texas, but at one time they had 3 homes. It was Houston and Park Avenue in New York and in Paris. So they would rotate between these homes as he would carry out his world duties and flying around. So she turned out very, very well. Much better than I. So it shows you should have gone into engineering rather than into medicine, because he's very wealthy.
Which sister lives in Belleville?
That's the sister that I thought was going to be born with the stork bringing her in. But there was no flight pattern that day that I could detect in delivery by stork. She was born in Charter Oak, Iowa. That's my sister Marion. Lives in Belleville, Illinois.
Thank you. Now, do you have any more to cover about Illinois College?
No, well, I guess so. Some activities occurred there that were of benefit, perhaps, to me. In high school, I did play athletics, and I played football.
Which high school was
Jacksonville High School. And then I didn't tell you about being a caddy. I started caddying right after my youngest sister was born. Actually, first summer was 9 years old, and that's when I started going out. So I caddied during the summer at this park called Nichols Park in Jacksonville, Illinois. We only had 9 holes, and the caddy fee was 25 cents for the 9 holes. And so I found out that if you really encourage these people, they might give you a little more than 25 cents. And so the fellows say, "Oh, how much do I owe you?" And I say, "Well, 25 cents, but sometimes they give tips." So that's strange for me, because I have a hard time asking for money. But I think about that, and now in a position as the president of the foundation for the American Academy, where we are trying to get money for our $5 million Bruce Spivey goal here for education, and I keep making the claim that I can't ask anybody for 15 cents. Doesn't quite fit with that story of the fact that I used to say that they used to give tips, or sometimes they give tips. Well, as a result of the fact that I was a caddy, then I learned to play golf very early, and therefore in high school I played on the golf team, and then in college I played on the golf team. And the fact I played football in high school, then in my sophomore year I was given a partial scholarship, which really helped with that $90 per semester tuition for the rest of my college. And I learned a lot about, I think, playing athletics. I think that's very important. Golf is more individual, although we did have a team, but it's a more individual sport, and it's a one-on-one, whereas football is a team sport. You have to put everything together with a group of people to make it work, whereas golf, everything depends just on you, the individual. So I think I learned something from having experience in both those arenas.
Any special teachers or events through grade school, high school, and college?
Oh, yes, I think I had the same experience that everybody had. I was very bashful, and I didn't think much of girls until, perhaps my senior year. But I remember my older sister taught me how to dance, And then she got me the date for the junior prom. And I finally got a pair of white flannel pants, and I got an old blue coat that had a hole in it. And so we covered up the hole with ink, trying to make it look like a decent coat to go with those white flannel pants for my junior year. And it was probably the most embarrassing circumstance in my life, having to take this first date, who was a big, fat girl with a lot of pimples. And she was happened to be a friend of my sister's, and nobody else would ever ask her for a date. And so I was the one who then carried out the evening. But that was absolutely one of the more miserable experiences of my life, I want to tell you. But I found there was more to girls than that, and I improved it a little bit as time went along. Now I like girls. Now, the other experiences I had in high school, I just don't think are worth mentioning. I was a pre-med student and in college, and so I had some wonderful instructors, even though it was a very small school, enough so that just the particular biology instructor by the name of D. Reich, Dr. D. Reich, had the clout to just about get you into any medical school, granted you had good grades, that you wanted. Therefore, I did well on that. But my medical school that I attended was really something of the necessity that, I mean, the selection of the school was dependent on necessity of economics. And just like the school I went to for college, I couldn't have gone to another college school, and thank goodness there was a college in the town in which I lived, or I may not have been able to go to college because of the financial problems that I've just talked to you about. But in selecting medical schools, my family then had moved on down to East St. Louis, leaving Jacksonville, Illinois, and my father was working down there then for a plumbing company. And as a result, then I could enter medical school and still live at home if I had the money to pay the tuition. The tuition was $600 a year. This is 1939. And I got the job I told you about, working as a bellhop and a stevedore on these ships on the Great Lakes. I worked on the South American, and we'd make this trip from the Chicago Navy Pier right here around to Mackinac, down into Georgian Bay, down to Lake Huron, to Detroit, and then Cleveland, and then Buffalo, and then return. It was a week run. And we'd do that for about 2.5 months. In that 2.5 months, we didn't get any pay at all. They just gave us a bunk and the food. And all of the bellboys were medical students. And I got that job by way of my sister, who had been a waitress on the ship a couple of years before and was still working on the other ship, the South American. And that was a great help. But anyway, working in that particular job and then never having a day off, work 7 days a week, day and night, but I earned enough money to go to medical school. In fact, we, as the bellboys, we felt we made more money on the ship except for the captain, just because of getting tips. And that's how I got my tuition for medical school. Now, I didn't have enough to live on, and therefore there was a reason that I had to go to school in St. Louis, because my family and I was living in East St. Louis. There are 2 medical schools in St. Louis. One St. Louis University, and the other is Washington University, St. Louis. Now, in my acquaintances in the pre-med group at Illinois College, then it was apparent that the majority of the qualified people coming out of that program chose Washington University over St. Louis University. And as a result, then I had an ambition to go to Washington University over St. Louis University. But I was bright enough at least to apply to both places. And I received acceptance from St. Louis University prior to receiving an acceptance to Washington University. By having that acceptance and executing it to enroll for medical school cost $50. So you had to matriculate with $50 being sent in to the school by a certain date. But therefore, that date approached. I still didn't have any word from Washington University with my application desiring to go there. And so I sent my $50 then to St. Louis University. Well, almost immediately thereafter, I received an acceptance at Washington University. But there was no more $50. There's no way I could have found $50 now that would be, I had to forego that when I sent it to St. Louis University. So as a result, then I had to allow the opportunity to go to Washington University to pass. And that's what determined I went to St. Louis University. I felt somewhat badly about it, but actually it turned out wonderful. I was so happy I went to St. Louis University. So some of the things you think are going to be, or just didn't go the way you want to, you can be all wrong about it. You can just turn out beautifully. And as a result there, I met my wife and got a certain slant in terms of, I think what's the most important in this life, which is about a matter we call religion. So it was a very, very important period in terms of forming my character, finally forming my character, by virtue of the fact that I had a chance to go to St. Louis University rather than Washington University, and it's wonderful that I only had $150. Otherwise, I would have gone to Washington University, and no telling how it would have turned out.
Let's see. Do you have some events that you would like to share, the experiences you had in medical school?
Well, in medical school, again, it was money, and so we used to cross the bridge. Another fellow who lived in East St. Louis, and myself, he had a car, and so we would cross the river every day and come over to medical school. Many of my medical colleagues belonged to fraternities. Of course, I would love to have belonged to a fraternity, but I couldn't afford that. I used to bring my lunch, and I was always embarrassed about bringing my lunch, and now I'm very proud. I'd take my lunch in a brown bag, go to the hospital and operate, eat out of my brown bag right in front of everybody, rather than go to the cafeteria because you don't have time, and furthermore, it doesn't cost anything. My housekeeper makes my lunch, which makes it exactly the way I want it, so now it doesn't bother me. But when I was a freshman in medical school, that did bother me because all my other friends went down to the cafeteria and they would have a good time, but I didn't have money to do that. So I would, this is my freshman year only, and so I would have this sandwich, squeeze it in my note bag, and then I would just disappear for everybody, and I would go into the toilet or the bathroom. So I would go into a toilet stall, eat my sandwich, so nobody could see me. That was I felt ashamed, the fact that I had a brown bag that everybody else didn't. And so I put up with that for a year. But then the next years, for the next 3 years of medical school, I fared a little better. So I got a job as a extern, they called it extern, second year, working at St. Mary's Hospital in East St. Louis. And there I was fed, worst food in the world, boy. But I had plenty of it, plenty of bad food. And I was taken care of there with laundry and no pay, but working as an extern every night and every other weekend. This is 1941, and in December now, 1941, Pearl Harbor occurred. I was working at the hospital at that time. I remember it so well. And right at that time, I met my to-be wife, who was a student at the St. Louis University in the School of Dietetics. And many people that will witness this certainly remember Angeline. We had 46.5 years of marriage before she was taken away from me. And we had a relationship then that continued until we were finally married when we left, when I left medical school. She was there just for a few months, then she went back to Cleveland and she lived with her family, and, and then we were married right after medical school. The next year, that'd be my junior year, then I got in another hospital in St. Louis, a much better hospital, much nearer the medical school, and that was at St. Anthony's Hospital. And in St. Anthony's Hospital, I continued in an externship for 2 years. So I was much better taken care of. And with my earnings from the shifts in the summer and then living in a hospital, then I got by. Except there was a big problem, and here's a wonderful thing about the people in America. One of the jobs I had in the period of even my freshman year, and continued on until my junior year, through my junior year, is that I would clean up, that's what you say. I was a clean-up man for the offices of this plumbing company that my father worked for in East St. Louis, Illinois. And I guess I was somewhat of an anomaly to the fellow who owned this plumbing company. And he had never had children, and so he became interested in me being in medical school, and so we'd have long conversations. And he always wanted to know how I was doing, and I guess he wondered what the low income that he was providing my father, how I could be in medical school. I'm sure that was probably amazing to him. But the fact is that we had a little bit of rapport developed. Now, that's important to this story about my senior year of medical school. Now, my senior year of medical school, the government was just beginning to accelerate the medical school programs. So there was no summer vacation. And one day we finished the junior year, and the next week, next Monday, after finishing the junior year on Saturday, we were now seniors on Monday. Hence, absolutely no vacation period. Well, I depended on my vacations to work on the ships to make some money. And so that was gone. And I thought, well, boy, I'm in trouble now, because you would be drafted then as a draftee into the ranks if you weren't in school. And I was very exposed to that possibility. But this particular person in this company, where I used to push the brush around and clean up the shop, why, he realized my plight. And he called me and said, I know you need help, and I'm going to help you. And so he gave me the tuition. Didn't give it to me, I mean, he loaned it to me. And that's some money that you just have an enormous debt of gratitude for. But it shows how wonderful the American people are. And I didn't ask him for anything. He just realized what the problem was. And so it was just like God sent it to me, and there it was. And as a result, then I could complete medical school, complete the 4th year. And then I went to intern at the San Diego Naval Hospital. Now, internships were paying $15 a month in most places, $10 a month. They give you laundry, food, and that was it. And I wanted to, I got married, and my to-be bride was working as a dietitian in Cleveland. So the other opportunity was Henry Ford Hospital. Now, Henry Ford Hospital paid $100 a month. And so everybody in the world wanted to go to Henry Ford Hospital in Detroit for their internship, $100 a month. But the other option was that opened up at the time is that you could get an internship in the military hospitals. And so that's what I chose. I chose the U.S. Navy, and I got accepted for an internship at the U.S. Naval Hospital in San Diego, which was something that I loved. And as a result, then, I was making the pay of a lieutenant junior grade, and boy, I was in heaven. And therefore, I got married a week after I graduated from medical school, just because of that.
Very interesting. From the Navy, and what happened?
From the Navy?
Yes.
Well, I had a year, well, I actually had 9 months of internship because everything was accelerated. And so medical school classes were 9 months, and internships became 9 months, and then you were shipped out. They did do a wonderful thing, I think, in the military program for internship. And they treated you like a surgical resident because they were preparing you for battlefield or shipboard medical needs. And with that being emphasized, you got a lot of surgery. In fact, I was on surgery for a good part of that. And the interns would do all the appendectomies with the instruction of a surgical resident. I mean, surgical resident, I'm sorry. But as a result, I really felt I had the equivalent of a first year or two surgical training, which helped me a great deal, I think, in surgery. One thing is it helped me to tie. In fact, I tie with my hands. And remember, all these other people come through that are ophthalmologists and have had no surgical training. You know how difficult it is. You've been through our training program. They just have never tied with their hands. That's a similar thing. So you learn a lot about technique at that time. A lot of burn treatment instructions, and that did me well. And ultimately, I was out on destroyers in World War II, and we went through several operations, and it sure put me in good stead to have had that training in the surgical field during my internship at the San Diego Naval Hospital. And many other things I learned, of course, other than surgery, but I do remember that as one of the outstanding experiences.
From San Diego Naval Hospital, then what happened?
Well, they sent you back home for, I mean the Navy, not they. The Navy sent you back home as a policy. Not, I shouldn't say home, but a station near your home. And it so happened there was a naval procurement station. This is a procurement for military officers in St. Louis. And so I was sent back there. The idea was to send you back for a few months and then allocate you to some combat situation. And I had put in a request for destroyer duty in the Pacific. And after a few months of back in St. Louis and serving this Naval Officer Procurement Station, then off I was shipped to the Pacific. And I was sent to a medical officer pool in Hawaii. And the chief medical officer for all the medical officers in the Pacific, he was on the staff of Nimitz, so he was in what they call SINCPAC. And in this Chief of Naval Operations office, this medical officer called two of us over one night, and both of us happened to be from St. Louis. Only this other fellow had gone to Washington University, and he had had his internship at the St. Louis, that's right, St. Louis City Hospital. And I had interned in the Navy. And therefore, I felt like I'm more important than he is. I'm in the regular Navy. I'd taken examinations, so I was in the regular Navy. He was in the Naval Reserve, just pulled in. So I've had all this experience in the Navy, and therefore I really should deserve the best of the jobs that are going to come up. So this Admiral medical officer then called us over late one night and said, you're going to be shipped out first thing in the morning from this base where they were being held in Hawaii. And he said, both of you want destroyers, so I got two destroyer openings right now. So one is a new 2800 Spencer-class destroyer, which I was drooling over. Boy, I'd love to be on that particular ship. And the other is a squadron, or rather a division, of 4 World War I four-pipers, they called them. 4-piper destroyers. They had taken off the 4th pipe, so they were 3-pipers. And they converted them to various things. And the division I had was a destroyer mine layer group. And so I was supposed to be the the person that was assigned to that would be the medical officer for 4 ships, but you could only ride on 1 ship at a time. You know that. Well, I certainly wanted the USS Johnson, which was the new big destroyer that was with the fast fleet of Admiral Halsey and Admiral Spruance, and that was the 3rd and the 5th fleet on these operations. That sounded very enchanting to me. But he said, well, we'll draw straws. And so I drew the straw that got me to the division of the old 4-pipers. He got the Johnson. Broke my heart. But again, this shows you what a quirk of fate. Now, the Johnson was in that battle of the Surigao Straits in the Philippines when the Japanese broke through. Then the big, heaviest, largest gunned battleship in the Japanese flotilla then was attacking these light carriers that were there for the Leyte Gulf battle. We were getting ready to invade Leyte. And the Johnson and the Hole and the Samuel B. Roberts were the 3 ships that actually turned and made suicide torpedo runs on these battleships. And they were actually literally blown out of the water. And the Johnson had no survivors. That's the ship that my friend was on that was lost. So I would have been on the Johnson. just by the pull of the straw. It made that difference. So these things always tend to work out, just like that going to St. Louis University versus Washington University. It worked out just beautifully, and it worked out just wonderfully that I was on the other ship. Now, we did have some combat problems with the other ship, and I did lose a few destroyers by getting that job, but I didn't get blown out of the water with the no survivor deal that happened to the personnel on the USS Johnson. So there we are. I'm out in the Pacific now, that part of my life. And there I decided I'm going to be an ophthalmologist.
How did that happen?
Well, I had a lot of time, you know, just, a lot of time doing nothing. And then when something did happen, well, it was just chaos. Such as, I mean, in combat, and you finally have a battle situation that gets you into trouble. But in that lag time, I just analyzed, what am I going to do with my life? And certainly I wanted to be whatever was the best. And so I was trying to think, what is it that I want? Well, I want something that I can do in the field of surgery. That was decided. Now, what surgical field are you going to get into? Well, I wanted something that I could really feel I could measure results in. So orthopedics sounded pretty good. But then the competition there was, well, if I really wanted to get into something most scientific, probably X-ray would be the best. It takes a certain scholarly background, and you have to be precise in that. But there you didn't have patient care. You didn't have the connection with the patient. But in surgical fields, you could actually do better. Well, one of the influences I came under when I went to St. Louis for that naval officer procurement just before going to sea duty was with an ophthalmologist. And he was the chief medical officer at that station. And he had put the bug in my ear and said, you know, if you want to do the smart thing with your life, you will become an ophthalmologist. And I said, why? He says, well, it's a surgical field, it's a medical field, it's a neurological field, you have constant care with the patients, and furthermore, everybody needs glasses. And so you'll never find yourself in financial hardships, no matter whether the depression is here or what, they're going to have glasses. And he was from Evansville, Illinois. His name was Chuck Like. He actually did eye and ear, nose and throat, but then he emphasized ophthalmology. And so that thought was still in my mind when it came to pass that I was trying to resolve what am I going to do with my life. And I then narrowed it down and said, well, I think I will become an ophthalmologist. And so that's what I did. And I started then studying and accumulate books in the Pacific. Only I lost those books, lost them twice. Because they were on the ships that went down that I was on. So I didn't do too well. But trying to get your hands on a Duke Elder and then lose it, that's like losing part of your soul at that time. So that happened to me twice. Anyway, I got back and then came to the Great Lakes Naval Hospital and just assigned there as a general medical officer. And I said, I want to be on the eye, ear, nose, and throat service. They didn't have just ophthalmology, nor did they have just ear, nose, and throat. It was the eye, ear, nose, and throat service at that time in all the military hospitals. But when you were assigned to that unit, then you could be ENT or you could be eye. Well, I had, I know a lot about eye. I've read extensively on it in the Pacific, but I didn't know how to refract. And, but that's where I got my start in ophthalmology, on that service at the Great Lakes Naval Hospital in 1940, in January 1946. Let me tell you a story about how I was delayed in getting there.
Please do.
It's an interesting story. Am I following the pattern that you want?
Oh, I think you did great.
Well, the story is that I really was disappointed. I have to back up even more than that. Let me go back to, let me go back to the destroyer I was on at the time that we invaded Okinawa. This was my fourth or fifth invasion activity I'd been on, and I've lost the first ship down, which was the Montgomery. I'd lost that down in the invasion of the Philippines, and then I lost another one at the invasion of Iwo Jima. That was the Gamble, and then here I'm on the Breeze. I remember I had 4 of these as medical officer. And I'm riding on one of the 2 surviving ships, which is the Breeze. And we were actually operating with the USS Indianapolis. The Indianapolis was carrying Spruance, the flag officer for their whole invasion of Okinawa. And the ship, the Indianapolis, was hit with a suicide plane right in the evaporators, put the ship out of action. Well, the Indianapolis then was sent back to Mare Island to have repair at the Naval Yard in Mare Island. Well, the big ship that was rendering all the needs, supplying all the needs that we had for our destroyer mine squadron was the Terror, USS Terror, T-E-R-R-O-R, CM-5. CM means a cruiser mine layer 5, and it was actually a cruiser type ship they had converted to being this mine layer. But it was a big ship, it had nice hospital facilities on it, and the fact is that I had spent 2 short terms of duty on the Terror when I'd lost these other destroyers, and so therefore I was well known on the Terror, but then I'd always have to go back when my other destroyer to which I was assigned would finally come into port, and then I'd be shipped back there. But consequently, I would go back every opportunity. We were in Anchorage always together, at various places, and spend time on the Terror. And because they had such a fine sick bay, and I knew all the medical officers and all the personnel, so we were out on this picket duty. We called it picket duty, or Navy called it picket duty. And so this Breeze was sent up with other destroyers, and so we would try to intercept these suicide planes coming down from Japan, to try to, which were in a desperation move trying to prevent us from actually capturing Okinawa. And so the nights one group of destroyers would go up, and they would be, about 50% of them would be lost, or at least hit with suicide planes. So it was a dastardly duty. But this one night I was on the Breeze, on the picket duty, and by golly, the Terror was struck in Anchorage. And it was a little anchorage off to the east, to the west of the island, of Okinawa Island. It's called Karama Reto. And all these ships were anchored over there under smoke covers. They burn these pots and create smoke. But the Terror was hit with a suicide plane, hit right in the sick bay. All the medical officers, all my friends were killed in there. And as a result, the captain of that Terror knew me. And when the medical officer was gone, he sent out, and he knew it was on the Breeze. And so he asked that the admiral, who in charge of all the minecraft of the Pacific, that the Breeze bring back me right away to the Terror. Well, the first medical officer aboard the Terror actually came from a public health hospital, and he was aboard a Coast Guard ship, and there was a little private type ship called the USS Bibb, and so the admiral for all the minecraft would leave the Terror and get on the Bibb and go out to see his little units during the day. So that was the function that that particular Coast Guard ship served. And the medical officer for all the Coast Guard were public health service. So this public health service doctor by the name of Glass, G-L-A-S-S, climbed aboard the stern of this Terror, which had been hit by a suicide plane, and there's no doctors surviving on that particular ship, no medical personnel. They had all these casualties, and he was then trying to get up to give the first assistance. Well, the ship deck was covered with oil. Everything would explode when the bombs blew up, and then it sprayed oil over everything. And he hit the oil on the stern of that deck when he put his foot over it, and he slipped, and he fell down all that height from the tall stern of this cruiser into the whaleboat below. And he died the next day of a pneumothorax. So here the first doctor coming was actually killed before he could ever get in a position to do anything. And so then I was the next doctor, so they make sure that I didn't fall in a whaleboat below when I came. As a result, the Terror was also sent back then to Mare Island. And both ships, the Indianapolis, which was Spruance's flagship, was getting ready for the invasion of Japan. Then the Terror had to get ready right away for the invasion of Japan. And so they had priority. So they worked around the clock trying to get these ships ready to return to their respective admirals out in the Pacific. And I was surprised one day when everybody was secured on Mare Island. All the workers were sent off the island. All the crews had to leave their ships and go over to a sequestered area on Mare Island, and nobody knew what was going on. The captain of our ship, which was lying just inside in this repair station of the Indianapolis. Indianapolis was outside, so we were two ships, and so we get to the Indianapolis, you had to walk across the Terror. The captain of our ship, the Terror, was belligerent. He wasn't going to let anybody haul him off, and so, boy, these FBI men came in and they just took him right off.
Okay, let's begin, gentlemen.
Well, the upshot of all this was that the 2 atom bombs, which this country had, were brought to Mare Island, and they were taken right across the deck of the Terror, which was the ship that I was assigned to, put onto the Indianapolis, a fast cruiser, and the cruiser then made a speed run to Guam and left the atom bombs, which were then used immediately to be dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which then brought the Japanese to the end of the war and hence avoid the necessity for invading Japan, which we were all poised to do at that time. Well, I didn't get back. I thought I should have gotten back to, because all my friends were getting back right away, it seemed to me, if they'd been out in the theater of operations. And here I was hung up. I had to go up to Japan with the occupation forces and hanging around on the island of Kyushu. And the problem was that nobody knew where I was in the Navy. And finally I got an all-nav message came out and it says, does anyone know the whereabouts of Marshall M. Parks, USN 134297? And that went to every naval station in the world. And when the communication officer heard that one morning about 4 a.m., he came and shook me in the bunk up on the ship in Japan, the Terror, which I was on, and said, boy, you're in trouble. You're really wanted for something. Well, what it was is that I didn't report to Great Lakes Naval Hospital. And it was something like 2.5 months after I was ordered to Great Lakes Naval Hospital. And so they were checking up as to why I didn't carry out my orders to report. The orders had been sent to the first ship that I was on, the USS Montgomery, which was sunk actually 1.5 years before this order was ever written up. So that shows you how badly the U.S. Naval record-keeping was in dealing with all these pieces of equipment that would disappear, and yet they still carried me in the personnel department as aboard a ship that had been sunk. Well, I got the Great Lakes Naval Hospital then, and then I requested the I duty. I got on the I service, and then the opportunity developed that might get into the basic science course run by Derek Vail here at Northwestern University. So that's what I succeeded in doing, and the Navy sent me down here. It was about a 4.5-month course, beginning in September of 1946 through January of 1947. And then I went back, really felt I was prepared with all the knowledge that you could ever know in ophthalmology, and was back on the eye service again. We had consultants that would come out. It wasn't really called a residency program, but it was a eye duty, only on eye patients. And there I became very disturbed about the fact nothing was done for the pediatric patients. And there was a high volume of pediatric patients. And pediatric patients were looked upon as the unwanted patients. So all the other medical officers said, gee, I don't want to see, that's just kids. I don't want to, I'm not interested. I want to see the older people that got the cataracts, got the glaucoma, and have retinal problems. That's what I want to see. And so I complained about that one time in our staff meeting. Well, I was immediately then challenged to say, well, if you don't like that, then we'll just make you in charge of all the children. And I said, fine, I'll do that. And so I then saw nothing but children. And they thought, I guess they were hurting me on that. And I loved it. And I could see the great deficiency in ophthalmology, which was primarily a geriatric specialty. And now you look at the Academy today. And what have the Academy programs been today? They've been the National Eye Care Project, which is very successful. It's been now Diabetes 2000. It's been glaucoma into 2021. And yet there's not been a program that the Academy has supported for pediatric patients. This is so typical of ophthalmology. It carries that stigma of being a geriatric specialty. And it was in 1946 the same way. There was no such thing as pediatric ophthalmology. So I made the resolve then, and I'm going to do something about this. I'm going to really see that pediatric ophthalmology is developed in this country. And the consultant, Perry Moss from Chicago, coming out to Great Lakes Naval Hospital. We'd come every other week or something such as that, made the comment to me, said, well, you know, there's already a person doing pediatric ophthalmology in this country. He said, he's kind of crazy, I think, for just doing that. And he said, the reason I know about that is my wife is an orthoptist, and she thinks a great deal of this particular person. I said, who is it? He said, Frank Kostenbader in Washington, D.C. And I said, I want to talk to him. So I got a hold of him right away. And he was very pleased to learn that somebody else was interested in pediatric ophthalmology. He said, come on down and see me, would you? This was in now the spring of 1947. So I went down in April 1947, and he said, as soon as you get out of the Navy, you come down and join me. And so that occurred, and then, so 47, I'm in Washington, starting my career in pediatric ophthalmology. And the career was to be a one-year, wasn't called fellowship because we didn't have the term even fellowship. It was a, what do we call that?
Preceptor?
Right, exactly, one-year preceptorship. I was the preceptee and he was the preceptor. And that was our beginning of the relationship between Kostenbader and Parks. And he gave me $200 a month. And I had 3 children at that time, and it was tough. But with some insurance physicals on the side, and the fact that he realized I couldn't make it, he gave me another $50 a month. So I got it finally to $250 a month. And then it came that after I finished that one-year preceptorship, that he said, well, why don't you just stay here? And I said, well, I would love to. So I just stayed with him then in the practice. And it grew, and he treated me so nicely. He was such an important person in my life. He's the father of pediatric ophthalmology, which we all know. And our fellowship program is named in his honor as for the alumni group, the Kostenbader Society, and the preeminent lecture given in the association now, which we have, the American Association for Pediatric and Ophthalmology and Strabismus. It's called the Kostenbader Lecture, as you know. But I can't tell you what part he played in formulating not only my knowledge in pediatric ophthalmology, but in many other areas in ophthalmology. In fact, he was a father to me. We had some peculiar relationships. We had many peculiar stories about that. But I stayed with him for 4.5 years, and I stayed in Washington ever since. Kostenbader became a national figure, and he did it primarily through the field of strabismus, not through just the pediatric part other than strabismus. And so therefore he related externally outside of Washington to just the strabismus world, but he was more than the strabismus specialist. So his local reputation was pediatric ophthalmology, but his national reputation was really in the field of strabismus. Early on, we'd always have lunch together. Kostenbader probably wasn't as ambitious as I. He liked to come to work at 9 o'clock, and he liked to finish at 5 o'clock, and he liked his long noon hour, and so therefore I was indoctrinated into that system. I saw a lot of wastage as far as time. I'm not being critical of Dr. Kostenbader. That was his lifestyle, so you wouldn't want to change it. But my lifestyle was to get on with it and get everything done you possibly can in the limited hours that you have available each day. And he had a little bit softer idea about things as that. So we used to go to lunch, a rather long lunch. But it wasn't a very fancy lunch. He always had the same thing. He had his hamburger and a Coca-Cola at this rather greasy spoon little place that we would go to. And that would cost him 35 cents. 25 cents for the hamburger and 10 cents for the Coke. And so I used to do that, except that we had different religions as far as our organized religions are concerned. And I happen to be Roman Catholic because of my conversion at St. Louis University. I didn't really get into, but that's enough said. Whereas he was a elder of the Episcopalian Church. But the thing that's important about the story is that at that time there was a restriction on your diet, so you had to eat fish on Friday. He didn't have to eat fish on Friday. And for me to get a fish sandwich at noon, it cost 1 nickel more than that hamburger. So I had to pay 30 cents for my fish sandwich, and he paid 25 cents for it. So he would always rub that into it. But I'd finally say, well, Dr. Costapeter, you must realize it always costs more to go first class. Costapeter didn't have the greatest sense of humor in the world. He didn't think much of that reply. So that just was dropped. No laughter whatsoever. Just subject would drop cold. So that was one of those things that backfire on you. Now, another thing that backfired on me in my relationship with Dr. Costapeter, just as a little incident, is that after spending that 1 year as a preceptee and now being part of the supposed practice, and I was getting 15% of the earnings, and he was getting 85% of the earnings at that point. And I felt so wonderful now. I'm going to be, I called myself a partner, but he didn't look upon me as a partner. So this particular morning, I walk into him and say, well, Dr. Costapeter, it's wonderful to see you this morning. We're starting a new part in our career. Since we're partners now, I'm going to say, good morning to you, Frank. I was calling him Dr. Costapeter before. And boy, I just like a stabbing with a knife. He looked up at me and he said, put his head back down. No hand came up. I just sneaked away. And therefore, I never called him Frank again. It was always Dr. Costapeter. The message came through loud and clear. Now, the next fellow that came along, or next person that came along for training was Dan Albert. Great guy, wonderful. And he had finished his residency at the Episcopal Eye, Ear, and Throat Hospital. It's now 1950, give me this exactly date, right? 1953. And in 1953, Dan joined him, and Dan got to the point where he would call him not Dr. Costapeter, not Frank, but Dr. C. And so it was always referred to as Dr. C. Well, by that time, Costapeter had either mellowed enough or he thought Dr. C was sufficient, and he accepted that. But this tells you a little bit about Dr. Costapeter. Another thing I always wondered about with Dr. Costapeter, and also my wife, and that is that he expressed some insecurity in this way, that he always had a double system to keep his pants up. He wore a belt, and he also wore suspenders. So he had a backup system. And I always thought, well, that's probably an expression of insecurity about his pants, never being caught with his pants down. But we had many little stories about that with Dr. Costapeter, but he was such a wonderful person and helped me immensely. So when I finally left him to go into private practice, he gave me 8,000 records. And that's how I started my practice. Just moved 3 blocks away from him, doing the same thing, yet we were together in everything that was done at the hospital. And then as a result of his national figure, then he began to attract trainees that would come by. Now at that time there was the Heed Fellowship, which was put into place and allow residents after their training to circulate around the country, go various places. And a few wanted to go into strabismus, rock and motility work. And as a result then, because of Costapeter's national reputation in strabismus, then he was soon selected by many of the Heed Fellows for coming by. And there they got their first exposure to the pediatric component of strabismus, whereas they got the adult component in other places. Costapeter was a purist. When he did pediatric ophthalmology, he said, no more will I see adult patients. So he looked upon his specialty, or the specialty that we now perform in, as strictly pediatric, whereas now, you know, it's been married together as the field of pediatric ophthalmology and strabismus covers all ages. But at least at that time, then, would just track the people who were interested in the pediatric part of strabismus. Well, that program, then, was the genesis of our fellowship training program. So these people would come by for 3 months. And I'd say that began probably in 1954. Every now and then would be an applicant. 55 more, the word got out, that's really the place to go. And then by 56, we were just constantly taking a person every 3 months. There was that big volume that wanted to be satisfied. And then by 1958, with Leonard Apt being the first, then he was a Heed Fellow. Then he got involved with a National Institute of Health. I don't think the National Eye Institute had been created at that time. And he hung around I just spoke with him the night before last, and he thinks it's 15 months. So that he was our first lengthy, what we call our own fellow, not a Heed Fellow. And so starting then from our own fellows that we've trained, now we're up to 120 of our own fellows. You're one of them. What number are you? Do you know?
56.
Number 56. Well, there were then 55 before you that followed, 54 that followed Leonard Apt. And it's been the greatest thing in my life because it's afforded me to be so active with a continual train of new, stimulating young minds coming into our field. Each one has a different personality, a different code by which what drives them. Some are tremendous self-starters, some you have to kind of feed along. But you have this variety and your challenge that's there every day from these young people. And I think that's been such a great thing in my life. In fact, I should have retired, I guess, some years ago, but I can't stand to be deprived of that great privilege I have from the stable of, and I mean like a horse stable, this stable of fine horses, which I have called my fellows. They're just a marvelous group, and who wants to dissociate themselves from that? Or I don't want to deprive myself from possibly engaging a few more before I have to finally pull away. So here I am. Probably should have quit, but can't think of it. Just can't think of it. And I would never want to be anything other than a doctor. I know I said I wanted to be a doctor from the time I was in grade school. Nobody can understand that. I think that I wish I knew. I don't, did my guardian angel out there just say you have to be a doctor? And every one of us have a guardian angel, and I must have a linebacker as a guardian angel to push me into that. But if that's the case, I do think that somewhere in my brainstem I was actually influenced by my brother's illness and my illness at age 7. I can't help. I think there must be some association there, but I can't prove it one way or the other. But anyway, I always had. What's that?
Any particular person?
No doctor led me into this. I didn't have any role model that I followed as a physician that said I must do this, except I mentioned about Charles Like, Dr. Like, in terms of helping me see the benefits of ophthalmology. But in terms of being a doctor, I don't have a role model that I can point to.
What would you say is most important to you that you live by?
Most important? I think the most important thing is that you see dignity in every person. No matter who they are, there's dignity. And you want to respect that. Some need help, bad help. And some you wish you could bend around to making themselves behave differently and appear differently. So I think that's number one principle that should be very foremost in your mind.
Are there any things that you feel, and I look up to you as a true teacher and father in academic sense. We're summarizing some of the things we have visited during our conversation. What are some of the factors which made you what you are today?
Well, I guess I had a drive to excel that certainly I can't deny. Maybe that's bad, maybe it's good, but it led to me having an academic record that was excellent, and I think having a good academic record and being a leader of your class, and making an honor society like the AOA early on, and then doing well because you just want to do well in all these opportunities that present to you. I think that carries on, and that carried on to me in the practice and in teaching. I wanted to be the best teacher, When I wrote something, I wanted to have it to be the best, so in the papers and books that I've been involved in, I just always had that. And that also opened up the opportunity as a teacher to be recognized, and finally I got recognized on the national scene, just like Dr. Costenbader. And then it got involved in somewhat of the medical politics, such as through the academy, and came up through the system there, and now I'm a past president of the academy, and then we started the American Association of Pediatric Ophthalmology. Now that's an interesting story. After we had enough alumni from our program, which was now 1969 in San Francisco, Earl Stern, who we just saw the other night from the University of California here in Chicago. Earl Stern was having a pediatric ophthalmology program at the University of California, where he was the pediatric ophthalmologist. And we sold him on the idea of that being the first opportunity for our alumni group from our training fellowship program to get together. And so therefore, I think about 13 of us then at that 1969 meeting in San Francisco started what we said was to be the alumni organization. Well, within a year we had named that alumni organization the Costenbader Society, after Dr. Costenbader. And we had their first meeting then in 1970. And as we moved along, we put on programs which had a national reputation. There was so much in demand. The alumni of our group, the Costenbader Society, felt very wonderful about it. And there was some dissension that developed when people on the outside that did also pediatric ophthalmology saw our success, and yet they weren't really a part of the program for this national program. And I could see the handwriting on the wall at that time, and so therefore I tried to impress the Costenbader Society on the importance of us turning over parts of this and being generous and getting all the other people involved that were in pediatric ophthalmology. There was some dissension, but we rode through that, and now nobody gives it a second thought. That's in the Costenbader Society. And we then had, growing out of that, the big organization, which was the American Association of Pediatric Ophthalmology. It didn't have strabismus on it at that time. So I think that was a very notable advance in our field. And then a few years later, to try to counter another society from being formed, which would just represent strabismus, and so many of us were people of repute in strabismus, and we felt that we knew all there was to know about strabismus, even though we were pediatric ophthalmologists. We then, through the cooperation and generousness of a few leaders in just the strabismus field, including Art Jampolsky and Philip Knapp, through their drive to join forces, then we were permitted to have this organization. I don't think Dr. von Norden was very enamored with his original position, but finally he came around, and he also, through his generosity, agreed that this was a good formula in this country. It's not a formula that's used in any other country. They either have strabismus societies or they have pediatric ophthalmology societies, but they aren't really married together, whereas it's unique in this country. And it's unique only because of the Costenbader Society having this input, this desire early on, not let it become set in concrete that we're going to have just this pediatric society, but they allowed them this amalgamation of these two disciplines into one, and I think it's been a wonderful strengthening outcome. I'm very pleased with that.
You have covered a lot of grounds, and some questions I have now, you may feel it's already covered. I cannot help but ask you, what would you consider your greatest achievement in profession and in life? They may be same or maybe two different areas.
Well, I think I've touched on
the personal part.
On that, yes. And the greatest achievement in my profession?
Yes.
The greatest achievement in my profession is just taking care of a little child. That's number one. And then all these other things are built on that. And the greatest achievement, then I have a greatest achievement every day that I'm in practice. So I can't say any one particular was the greatest achievement. But that repeats itself every day. And I don't want to give that up. That's number one. And then I guess then followed from that would be the teaching opportunity to prepare others for doing the same thing that I get such enjoyment out of, such self-satisfaction out of. And I just hope that they who are the trainees will get the same self-satisfaction that I get out of my work in this field, and as they then proceed through their life. So this is what it's all about. And it's not about money, not about income, it's not about prestige. I've been very privileged to have achieved a certain national prestige, which I consider to be very unimportant. It's just I was trying to do something as a result, then you get certain prestigious positions when you do that, I guess, in a satisfactory way. But those are not something that I consider important in my life. It's certainly not basic, but the real thing is the patient care and the teaching.
It's sharing and generosity.
Well, I guess that's right. Sharing and generosity. You can't share unless you're generous.
That is teaching.
Mm-hmm.